Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra Krajewska and I'm the Executive Director of the European Association of Paritary Institutions. I would like to thank all of you and to welcome you to our joint AEIP and Pensions Europe webinar on the topic of social and governance factors in pensions. AEIP is an organization representing social protection providers managed on joint or paritarian basis by the national social partners, and in that sense are a crucial element of social and labor frameworks. We believe that in the current environment and with the many uncertainties ahead with major social and economic implications, the focus for pension funds, also in their important role as institutional investors, should be as always on ensuring adequate and sustainable pension benefits to their beneficiaries. In order to do that, we believe that it's also crucial to foresee their contribution to a wider set of social objectives at national and European level and on the basis of appropriate governance models in place, ensuring inclusive and long-term oriented growth. We're looking forward to the discussions today on these important topics, and I take the chance to also thank all experts who agreed to join the two panels today and to share with us their perspectives. With these remarks, I'm happy to welcome you again to our joint AEIP and Pensions Europe event, which importantly is also part of the second edition of the European Retirement Week. I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Matti Lepala, Secretary General of Pensions Europe.
Thank you, Alexandra. Welcome to our webinar. Pensions Europe represents 25 national pension fund associations across Europe, and our goal is that people in Europe will have good pensions, and we believe that funded pensions play an important part in this. Achieving good pensions has a great social value and is a social goal. During the next 2 hours, we will discuss diversity in pension fund management bodies, S&G considerations in investment decisions, and incorporating social and governance factors in investment decisions of pension funds. But we will start with a fireside chat on equality, diversity, and inclusion, which are important and overarching issues and form part of the basis for the S consideration in ESG. And importantly, how are they taken into consideration in pensions and in financial services and in broader society. I'm very happy to welcome to discuss these issues Petra Hielkema, the Chairperson of EIOPA, our European regulator and supervisor, and Åsa Norri, who is the Regional CEO and Head of Distribution at Principal Asset Management. Principal is a leading US asset management company with a very long history and a presence also in Europe. Welcome, Petra and Åsa. What are, in your opinion, the main problems in EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion? And how personal are these issues for you? Petra.
Yes, hi Matti, and thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here in European Retirement Week. I think it's a very important topic, pensions, to discuss. So I think it's great we really make time to discuss this, and how better to start than with the topic of diversity and inclusion. I think that if you look at society and how diverse it is key to see that diversity also back in the boards of pension funds, because pensions matter to everyone. So I think that first of all is very important. Is that personal? Well, first of all, it is definitely not just part of my work, but something that is really dear to my heart to really achieve in the term that I have, more diversity in pension boards, particularly gender diversity, but also cultural diversity, different backgrounds, different colors. I think that would be very beneficial for boards. Is it personal when you look at how do we deal with pensions? Yeah, I think still a lot needs to happen. I see that women already have a pay gap, but pay gaps tend to be double as a pension gap. And I have a lot of female friends that concerns that. So it is personal, and I think it is something that we therefore need to discuss here today, but also with friends and with family and with society.
Thank you, Petra. Also, you have a long experience in working with financial services. What are your views on this issue?
Thank you, Matti. Yes, I have nearly 30 years experience in the financial sector, all of it in the UK actually. But I grew up in Finland, and a country which is very much a leader in diversity, equity and inclusion. You know, the country was the first in Europe to give women a right to vote in 1906. And I certainly started my own company when I was only 20. And I had many role models, both male and female. My leadership is very much focusing on strength. Growing up, I was very comfortable being who I was, being a woman. UK is, of course, a very different society to Finland, and that's where I made my career in asset management for the past 30 years. I've seen a lot of change and a lot of evolution in our society. And when I started in portfolio management in the mid-90s, I certainly didn't see a lot of diversity at that time, but we have certainly seen a big evolution. Principal, yes, so we have 18,000 employees globally, and we were the founder of retirement thinking in the US 145 years ago, so very long, deep roots in thinking about pensions. Why we exist? Well, we want to foster a world where financial security is accessible to all. What we do, we want to help more people save enough, protect enough, and have enough for retirement. And what we want to aspire is to lead the way the financial confidence is perceived in our society.
Thank you, Åsa. Also, in Europe, many are still experiencing discrimination, inequality, social exclusion. This can be based on their gender, ethnic or minority background, disability, skin color, religious belief, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, and many other factors. This calls for recognition in legislation and in policies to promote equality and non-discrimination, and how progress can be monitored and measured. That's why data on these issues, EDI issues, is a crucial element and a powerful tool to support the fight against discrimination and exclusion. Petra, do you think, or do you believe policymakers and supervisors have good and reliable data available for them to recognize relevant problems, and what needs to be improved?
Well, thank you, Matti. And yes, data is of course very important when you make policy, because you try to understand, if you come up with ideas for policy, what the impact will be and how, what the outcome could be. And you do that by looking at the data. So the starting point is data. And I think, first of all, as supervisors, we've at the EU level as well, we've gone through a process of getting more data, having good checks and balances in place for having high quality data. But there's a but. I think, first of all, in comparison to insurers, in my authority, we still have less data on pension funds, so that is a first. And second, and I think this is where you would really, if you would ask me, like, what would you really additionally like to have, it is we yet do not split out, for example, in gender between men and women when we look at how many pensions are there, how sufficient are those pensions. For we do feel that there is a pension gap that is bigger for women than for men. So a split between those numbers would be very helpful. Saying at the same time that will be in addition to a data set that is already very good. maybe to add to that, when we use those data, still we have to be very conscious of what is the actual data set that we're using. For example, there are some good intended products for people who are self-employed to start saving for their retirement, but they tend to have a threshold, like you have to earn more than 10,000 euro and then you can join. Now that in itself is a nice policy to motivate and help people to save for later, which is necessary. And still 1 in 5 Europeans has a risk of old age poverty, so more savings is required. But if you look at the number more specifically, you will see that 10,000 is probably a threshold that can be reached easier by a certain part of society that is maybe working full-time, that has the better jobs, whereas for those who have smaller jobs or work part-time, it is not. And somehow some of the groups that we want to include tend to be in the latter group. So again, even if we think about policy on the basis of those data, we always need to check again, are we really addressing the right group in our society? And then going back to boards and what is necessary, I think you need to have those people in the room when you make the decisions so that they make you think of these questions.
Yes, definitely. Data needs to be an important part of policy considerations and of course basis for regulation then if that is introduced. But also, what is in your experience the relevance and the role of data and how in your company or in your experience has data played a role in recognizing and dealing with these issues of diversity, inclusion and equality?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, data is key. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is core for principle, and we are incredibly transparent, and it's very much a focus for us. Why? Because our clients, our investors expect us to be. They expect full transparency here, and we need to clearly articulate what we do around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And also, we want to attract, we want to retain, and we want to develop our talent, our employees. So we want them to reflect the rich diversity of our global customers and their needs and their goals. And we only can do that by having a diverse workforce. Across our management, as a management business, we spend a lot of time on career development and thinking about opportunities for our employees. 4,000 of those 18,000 we employ, they are engaged in 8 different employee resource groups and 6 different networks. In total, if you look at some of those, there are women in technology, women in sales, African American and Black, LGBTQ+. So various society to very much offer an open debate. When I look at some of the data numbers, 40% of our employees are women, 12% are of color, 26% of our investment teams are women, which is a very high number compared to when I started in the mid-90s. And also when we look at distribution, the client-facing element of our investment business, 30% are women. We have aligned our resources around the investment practices with 7 of the UN targeted sustainable development goals that we focus on. And when I look at Europe, which is the business that I lead, we have focused around 2 key initiatives. One is very much the health and well-being in its entirety, and of course diversity and inclusion. I myself am a big advocate for this, and I play an active role. I'm mentoring employees myself. I am a mentee, so I have a mentor, and I also have a sponsor. And I think when it comes back to your initial questions too, I think it starts with us. Naturally, the policymakers and supervisors have a key role, but we as leaders of firms, we have to step up.
Very interesting, thank you, and really goes to show how much these issues are considered and measured in a US-based company. I think in Europe that's not done to that extent, at least not many or not by all. I think in Europe the focus in the latest development has been on the gender balance in management boards, now new legislation has been introduced on listed companies, bigger listed companies, and I'm sure that will have an impact. And of course, it stems from practice from various countries in Europe that have already had this in place. So turning to this issue, the diversity in management boards, Petra, what do you think hinders diversity in management boards, and what needs to be done to overcome these problems? And would quotas, like quotas now in the listed company legislation and previously in some countries like Norway have been in place, would quotas be helpful, even starting with just the gender balance quota, not going into all the relevant issues, and could they capture other aspects, also than gender?
Well, that is, of course, a very important question. But let's start by why would you want more diversity in boards? And I think it's not only that you then show that you are a better reflection of society, that you are actually supporting with your pensions, but it shows that it is a board that cares for diversity. I think that it's simple, that tone at the top, that you are at board level, conscious of it, and you are walking the talk. I think that is why it's so important to see diversity on boards, to have boards that really care for it and that focus on it. Because if you do that and you do that properly, you will also recognize that probably at the entry level you are pretty okay when it comes to diversity, but then moving up, somehow your pipeline is not working. I think that is a next step after having a diverse board. It's realizing that finding a diverse group of people in your recruitment process might be hard. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do it. I often hear, well, Petra, that is very hard because we can't find the people. And then I'm like, well, then you don't have your pipeline in order because they are really there. So that is the next reason. You do it because you walk the talk, because you care. And if you care, you work on your pipeline. And when you do that, it will fill up and it will be a better reflection, ending up, and there's a lot of research on that, in better decision making, in more inclusive decision making. Now, how are we going to achieve that, and would quota help? I would always start from first finding other tools to encourage, to make sure people act and to see if that happens. And we do see that. I truly believe that if you haven't solved the gender issue by now and you haven't moved on to other diversity, you're probably a bit behind the curve. So you need to step up. But at the same time, I think there are moments where you need to ask the question, do we need quota? Because if it's not happening fast enough, just simply setting a quota can really focus the discussion. So I'm not at the point as a chair of EIOPA to say we need to do that tomorrow, but I am as a woman saying that I see moments where actually quota will help, and you need to pick carefully the moment that is needed.
Thank you. I mean, also, I think it's right to say that you are one of the very few women in your position in the financial sector in Europe, maybe even globally. So what do you think about the obstacles and how to overcome them? And would quotas set in legislation be helpful or not?
Thank you, Matti. Yes, it's a lonely world, the financial world, as a woman for sure. And I think echo some of the points Petra is making. I think the further up the ladder, if you call it, you climb, the lonelier it gets. So we just need to pull other women up behind us. But yeah, so three things. So yes, regulation. So regulation does help. I'll actually take a comparison to sustainability. I saw on the board of the pension plan of one of the largest UK FTSE 100 firms 5 years ago when the UK implemented a responsible investing requirement into each pension plan's investment management agreement. So the IMA overseeing the regulation in the pension plan had to have a responsible investing policy that very much changed the behaviours and the call for action for us as Board of Trustees. So regulation, aligning it correctly, will help. It will focus the attention on a certain deadline that I've seen happening. Secondly, I would call on safety in numbers. So I sit on also over and above my day job. I also sit on some charities and foundations. And again, safety in numbers. I'm one of 3 women in one of those particular boards. And I would certainly say that I see it making easier it's easy to make a difference or having a different standpoint if I am among another two women. Evolution, right? As a leader, I don't like revolutions. I think it's very difficult to bring our shareholders with us. I also find it difficult to bring our clients and our people with us. And therefore, I'm endorsing an evolution. And I would also echo that the policymakers should think about an evolution here. It's easy to adjust when it comes to how we need to shift through an evolution. I think if we combined the minority aspect, not only just gender, but there's just broadly, in my view, the diversity of thought is really important. And not just the gender diversity, but overall. So combining those, I think, would make things easier, Matti.
Yeah, easier, but then there's always this question of like, what is the impact? What's the difference? Do you think that? Do you agree with this growing body of research that indicates that management bodies with good EDI credentials, so that are based on equality, diversity, inclusion, that they perform better and make better decisions than those without these? Does this really have an impact in your experience and your view on performance?
Is that a question to me?
Yes,
yeah,
please.
Absolutely, Matti. Absolutely. I absolutely agree. How we lead entails and empowers, leaderships all the way from the C-suite to the front line, and it very much creates a purpose-driven culture which changes the performance, and it truly inspires people. I know the principal is doing something right here. We've done employee surveys, and a recent one showed that 80% of our employees in our asset management business feel they have the support they need from their leader to be open and be themselves at work. So that culture and commitment to employees, I feel, is significant. And I think it's a reason why Principal has been recognized now for 10 years for the best place to work in money management. I guess leaders must show commitment. So in terms of we need to serve a number of broader stakeholders and their agenda. And I think this has dramatically shifted post-COVID-19. We've seen that. So we leaders at the top, we need not only to demonstrate the leadership in the economic framework, but we also need to speak out about aspects linked to diversity, equity and inclusion issues more generally. We need to feel confident to have those conversations. And that's an expectation. So I hear that regularly for a number of our investors here in Europe. And I think we, as an industry, we need to provide training, we need to provide tools to make it easier for leaders, male as much as female, to know how to adjust to this sort of best in class. And that's a combination of online tools and also development programs in person. I think we all know that trust arrives on foot and disappears normally very quickly. And I think that that's something that's incredibly important. And, it's all about the engagement and morale that the staff is feeling. We very much feel we need to think hard around how we gain those results. And we do something called pulse surveys to really assess the mood among our people so they can feel open and honest around what it's like working in the company. We track these surveys to see how we're going to address some of the sentiment and the morale within our people and workforce, and that being held accountable and being open and transparent very much as a leader is something I've been sort of advised. It seems to be coming more easily for a woman than a man, certainly in the experience they've had with my leadership with us in Europe.
Very impressive, and of course, in the end, it is the companies and the people who change things and make a difference in this. I would assume already what you already said, that you would also agree that a good EDI improves pension outcomes. But what do you think should be the role of EIOPA and pension supervisors, and how can they effectively support the development of a good EDI culture?
Well, I think what supervisors do is they look at a company and they ask questions. And asking questions means that you look at the governance and you ask the question, I look at your board. I see non-diversity in the board, and we do see that. We see boards that have same age, same background, same gender. And the question is, do you have debates? I always ask, is there ever a clash in your board? Do you ever think like, oh, this was a tough discussion? Because I think then you really cut to the chase as a board. If you all the time always agree and have a great time, you probably feel that you have a nice job, but I'm not sure if you're doing a good job, because sometimes decisions are tough. And at that moment, you want to have leaders that want challenge. You want to have leaders that want to have different views. And in order to get those, you probably need to get out of the comfort zone that is your circle and find others. And so when it comes to leadership, when it comes to a fit and proper assessment that we do as supervisors, and discussing with the CEO how they feel they should have a board, when you look at a board itself, but then if you also look at the culture in a company, I think these are all questions we can ask. And ultimately, of course, as policymakers, we can also ask the legislator to make changes to law when needed. And as I said, it's key to have that informed decision making even better than it in sometimes already is, or just better because it's not that good. I think there's two situations, but it also sends a very strong signal to both the customers, the beneficiaries, the members, but definitely also to staff, and helps them in itself to develop further. And you won't believe in, and I can imagine also that you can relate to this, that since I have started, how many women, but also women with different backgrounds, but also men say that they feel inspired because there is something different. And I think that in itself is helpful, that we show that it doesn't really matter who you are, it matters what you do, and everyone can be part of what I think is a great industry. But they need to be themselves, because then they add most value. And we need to create that space where they can actually be themselves and do a good job.
Yes. I think everybody would agree, and everybody, I think, has seen the great job that you have done since you started as the chairperson at the EIOPA not that long ago. Our next part of the webinar will be a panel discussion on diversity, inclusion, and in pension fund boards. And to bridge over to that panel, I would like to ask the final question to Petra, to you, on the ongoing or forthcoming review of our European Pension Fund Directive, EIOPA 2, and as it provides an opportunity to consider whether new provisions regarding EDI in the management bodies or otherwise in this legislation should be introduced in the European prudential framework. What are your thoughts about this, and what can you say what you're planning to do with this topic?
Yes, I can, and I'll start being really, really honest. When we started to get ready for the EIOPA 2 review, and the advice were also being asked for through a call for advice, to give advice on how that should look, I actually was amazed to find out that in the EIOPA 2 directive there is no language right now on the need for diversity on boards. I was amazed. And I also know that it is in the banking directive. It's also not in the insurance directive. We're making proposals there as well. For EIOPA 2 we will propose to include the need for in governance to have a diversity on the board. And we're suggesting this now, we're discussing this with stakeholders. I'm pretty amazed that some actually push back on that and have concerns. Some concerns relate to the pipeline, but I think that is a matter of allowing for time. But get the pipeline organized, please. I think we should have done that already for long. Yes, we need quality in boards, but I think the quality is there if you build your pipeline. I'm also getting pushback because of this new regulation at the EU level, but you said it very right. That's just for listed companies. But pension world, particularly pension world, that is so diverse, that has smaller and middle-sized entities, it doesn't end at the listed companies, and we still need the diversity in a proportionate way, but we need it. So that is what we will be recommending. I'm very much in favor of it, and you know now what we're going to write on that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very open response, and I think good food for thought for the panel and for the discussions to follow. So thank you both for this excellent discussion and sharing your experience and insights with us. Now it's time to turn over to our first panel discussion on diversity in pension funds management boards. This topic is part of the ongoing review, as we heard, of the European Pension Fund Directive, EIOPA 2. And I'm very happy to welcome Wiljan Jacobs, who works as a policy advisor on sustainable investment at Pensioenfederatie, the Dutch Pension Fund Association, which is a member of both PensionsEurope and AEIP. Wiljan, I hand over to you.
Hello, welcome to this part, the first panel of this afternoon. I'm Wiljan Jacobs. I'm policy advisor at Pensioenfederatie, the Federation of Dutch Pension Funds. And in this first panel, we will discuss more about diversity in pension boards. For this panel, we have three very interesting and very diverse speakers, I can say. The three speakers we have is, the first is Tanachia Ashikali. She's assistant professor at Leiden University. Samantha Gould, she's head of public relations and campaigns at Now Pensions in the UK. And here in the studio, Anne Verlinde, she's secretary general at Pensio Plus in Belgium. After my introduction and a poll, I will switch over to Tanachia, and she will introduce on her research about the importance of diversity in pension fund boards and the barriers hindering it. But first, I will introduce a poll because we want to have your opinion about the next question. How diverse is your pension board? We have 5 different options. It's not diverse at all. It's quite diverse. It's diverse enough, you think. Diverse, but it can never be enough. And also another option is, of course, that you're not working for a pension fund. We're really curious about the results. We will see the results after the presentation of Tanachia. Tanachia, I will switch over to you, and I'm very sorry because I think I spelled your name wrong again.
Wiljan. My name is Ashikali. I'm an assistant professor at Leiden University. And today I will present something about our research on diversity and inclusion in pension fund boards. Could I have the slides? Yeah, thank you. I'm hearing an echo in the presentation. Do you as well?
I can hear it.
Okay. Oh, it's fixed, I think.
I can't see your slides either.
So we need some assistance from some from the tech support. Just trying again. Much better, I think. Yes, thank you. So as I said, I'm an assistant professor at Leiden University, and we studied possible barriers and hindering factors in pension funds, fund boards, and facilitators. And the reason that we studied that was because Dutch governance codes require at least one woman and a person younger than 40 in pension bodies. But yet in 2020, only 60 of the 181 funds met those criteria. So only 1/3 of the pension board seemed to meet those criteria, and 2/3 did not. So in our study, we wanted to get more understanding of what is going on in those boards, what explains that some do meet those criteria and some boards don't. Next slide, please. We conducted a qualitative explorative study by conducting several qualitative interviews with different stakeholders, both within pension fund boards as outside, like the monitoring committee and organizations that were involved in developing programs for young candidates. We also conducted a document analysis of yearly reports to see what were pension fund boards doing and to what extent they also had a diversity and inclusion policy with specific practices that complemented that. And finally, we held a focus group with experts on diversity and inclusion, as well as experts on the pension sector, to see to what extent our findings resonate with their experiences and what kind of implications can we then develop based on our results. So first, on the hindering factors. Some of the respondents experienced an accumulation of different codes they had to meet. So there are several governance codes that affect that tell pension fund boards to which criteria they should look for when selecting new candidates. And they felt that diversity was yet another criteria atop of a lot of different criteria they already had to meet. One of the things they also mentioned is that they looked for experience in candidates and used sometimes quite subjective criteria to define what experience meant. And using that as a selection criteria already excluded young candidates that did not particularly have board experience, but could indeed bring another perspective, another competency within the board, but that was not seen as a quality that was required to include. A third factor, and I think also one of the most important one, was the dependency on social partners. So paritarian pension fund boards were dependent on nominations, and often those nominations were not diverse, and boards didn't really try to change that, and they felt they had little room to ask or select another candidate that could meet more diverse criteria. We also saw that pension fund boards still recruited in their own, sometimes rather homogeneous networks, which resulted in selecting typical profiles that were already existing in pension fund boards, and also people rotating between several different boards. So my slides are now gone. Thank you. There are a couple of facilitating factors as well. So we saw that pension fund boards had internal development programs aimed to prepare young candidates and candidates with less experience so that they could also include more diversity within the boards. And some funds also make use of external development trajectories, such as in the Netherlands, there is the Pensioen Lab, which develops programs for young, talented persons that are interested in management functions in the pension sector. Some boards also saw that the way they talked about pensions already affected their reach and the people they attracted to certain positions. They really tried to change that to have more inclusive communication in vacancy text. So different criteria were mentioned. They also looked into selection processes and how they could limit potential biases that were present, and try to select people that really brought in a different perspective that was complementary to the existing board. And one of the important things also was having role models, especially female board members saw that they could reach out to other women in the sector and help them realize certain potentials, and also explaining what it meant, of what it entails to have a board function. And finally, organizing network and career events were helpful in reaching young potentials, and also made it more insightful what it meant to what it means to have a function within such pension board. Next slide, thank you. So the previous hindering and facilitators were differently for boards that had a concrete intrinsic diversity motive and boards that really didn't have that motive. So to explain, boards that really intrinsically were motivated to realize a representative board and to reach out to a diverse society and have those different perspectives also included in their decision making, didn't perceive as many hindering factors other boards mentioned that didn't have a concrete motivation. We saw that pension fund boards that didn't really have that intrinsic motivation were primarily aimed to represent the interests of trustees, and often those trustees were also quite homogeneous to some extent, resulting in them not seeing the advantages of a broader spectrum of diversity. And having a specific governance code aimed at gender and age also meant that these types of boards only looked at those kind of dimensions of diversity and failed to see other important dimensions as like ethnic culture or personalities or different competencies that could complement the board. We saw that boards that didn't really have an intrinsic motivation also failed to have concrete diversity and inclusion policies that really were integrated to change core work processes and decision-making processes that were needed to develop an inclusive board culture. And those boards that were intrinsically motivated really tried to think of how could they change how they work together, how they communicate within the board, how they could integrate also minority voices that otherwise wouldn't be heard and included. And especially chairpersons were said to have an important role model function as well, to invite different perspectives and also show that diverse perspectives are valued within the board. Next slide, please. So to sum up, we found multiple perceived hindering factors and facilitators, which also seem to be dependent on the clear motivation or vision on diversity and inclusion. So it's important to have a clear vision on what does diversity mean for a certain management body, and how can you achieve that diversity and include that in the decision making as well. It means having a concrete policy that is tied to long-term goals and also integrated with existing norms, self-evaluation and key functions. Also to integrate it in how pension fund boards already work and not try to develop new extra things that are perceived as a hindering or burdensome factor. Rather to see diversity invested in one specific individual, for example, a person younger than a certain age, you should see diversity as a feature of the board as a whole. So how can you complement missing perspectives, missing experiences in the board will help in achieving more diversity. And finally, I think also really relevant is not only looking at the pension fund boards, but also in the so-called pipeline, which was also mentioned before, in how you could stimulate the diversity in nominations and also stimulate diversity in supervisory boards or other bodies surrounding the pension fund boards, creating a pipeline or so-called stepping stones for different candidates to also ultimately being able to take place in such management functions. Thank you. So that was my presentation.
Yes, thanks, Tanachia. Thank you. Very interesting conclusions, I think. I also have the conclusions or the results of our poll, and the answers are quite diverse as well, I can say. So 38% is not working for any pension fund, so we can skip that one. But 38% as well says it's not diverse enough, or it's quite diverse. And 26% says it's diverse enough or diverse, but it can never be enough. So it's quite diverse, I have to say. What do you think? Is this surprising for you, the result?
No, it's not that surprising. I think there is always clear room for improvement, but I think it's not EDI on its own. I think it's linked to other elements which might make it more complex. And I can come up with three arguments which are definitely sure for the Belgian market, but perhaps also for other member states in Europe. On the Belgian market, a pension plan often is created for a specific group of people, either one company or one industry, for instance. So the people on the board do represent that specific group. Furthermore, the pension plan often is designed by social partners. It's an agreement between employers and employees, and the EIOPA is just the executor of the plan design. And often the social partners do agree that a plan is managed, the EIOPA is managed by social partners, sometimes in a paritarian way, but not always. Which means that on the board you have representation of employees at one side and employers at the other side. So we are already talking about a specific group, and we are already talking about employee representation, which often is linked or even directly a result of social elections, which of course are ruled by social and labor law. So I think if we are thinking about diversity on the board, we also need to take into account that employee representation or paritarian representation should be respected. Furthermore, of course, since EIOPA 2 and even before EIOPA 2, we already knew the fit and proper requirements, and of course more the fit requirements are rather tough. For some of us, we notice that Belgian EIOPs really do discover problems to find employee representators, but also employer representators due to these more severe fit requirements. So if we put diversity requirements on top, it can even become much more complex. I think we in Belgium do discover this complexity because we have a small market with small pension funds. And I believe that in a board where you only have 4 to 6 members, where a lot of the activities are outsourced, of course, it becomes much more tougher to take into account all these elements, results of social elections, fit and proper requirements, and perhaps also EDI requirements in the future. But I'm not advocating here not to talk about diversity. I think talking about it and creating awareness, I think, is a must for every board.
Yeah, that's true. I think, and that's just a good thing that we're talking and discussing it right now. Now we discussed the situation in Belgium, but I'm really curious, how is it in the UK? Samantha.
Hi, good afternoon, and
Hello.
happy retirement week. So in the UK, there's been a massive focus around ESG issues, and diversity and inclusion is, I guess, tackling the S side, so the social side. And I think obviously in the UK, we've had the introduction of automatic enrolment, which now means that there's more people in the UK saving than ever before. So it's over 20 million people. And I think it's really important that the makeup of a trustee board is reflective and representative of the savers who they are making the decisions on. And there are more women saving than ever before, more people from ethnic minority backgrounds, people with disabilities, and also people who aren't traditional 9-to-5 workers. So, you know, they might have multiple jobs. And I think it's really important that we avoid things like groupthink and kind of unconscious bias, and we do start to have trustee boards that are really representative of all the savers who they are ultimately making really important decisions on.
The quality of decision making is better, you think? Oh,
Is that all I think?
sorry. Do you think my question? I think you didn't hear my question, but I'm curious. Do you see a difference between now and 10 years ago in the quality of decision making?
We're on a journey. Obviously, auto-enrolment has massively changed the landscape of UK pensions. So as we move away from the gold-plated DB schemes, obviously it was now moving into DC schemes. I think there's a wide acceptance that people aren't saving enough. And I think there is a responsibility not just on individuals themselves, but as a trustee who are essentially making important investment decisions around, you know, the certain funds, but also working with the regulators and, you know, the wider industry to try and raise awareness and increase communication with the actual members of the funds. So I'd say it has improved. I said we're on a journey, but yeah, I think there is a lot more to be done around kind of the engagement and increasing awareness and the importance of pension saving in the UK.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'm switching to Tanachia. So thank you for your very interesting research, and I think it's a fact, we can say it's a fact, that the quality of decision making is better if the diversity of the boards are better. Yet still a lot of people are discussing about this. Why you think it still affects people discussing about?
Do you mean why it's still like complex and that we need to raise awareness still on the topic?
It is.
Yeah, I think it's because there is a certain norm now that exists in the way we look and evaluate certain qualities and what we render to be important. And with the changing societies, that quality perspective is also changing, but the people taking the decisions is not changing along. And therefore, we need to still have these discussions and voicing why diversity is important, because decisions that are being made do not reflect the needs that are present in society, the needs of employees, the needs of employers. So that's one of the explanations, I think, and also because it's also quite a complex issue. Also seeing how the pension sector is organized in a certain way, which makes it difficult to reach diversity and to really have room to maneuver compared to other organizations that really can make use of a really diverse pool of candidates. But if you are really willing to make a change, then you can find room or discretionary room and really influence also social partners to change how they or the way they select certain nominees, and that could also contribute to more effective governance codes to that extent.
Yeah, and what would your advice be in the future about a next governance code? Should there be other factors of diversity in it, you think?
Well, it's quite complex already with different codes and different competencies that are important. But I do think diversity is really a broad a concept that could include also ethnic background, but also other not that visible characteristics. And I think regulation or codes can have or stimulate organizations to really look into it. But what really matters is having an inclusive culture to really change the way organizations work in selecting, in recruiting people, but also in how minority voices are included in decision making, and specifically chairpersons or supervisors could have an important role in that process, showing or behaving in a role as a role model, but also stimulating inclusive behaviors to appreciate diverse voices.
What do you think? Do you agree on this?
I totally agree with what Tanachia is saying. It's not only about good representation of the employees for whom you are managing the pensions. It's also about bringing together different professional backgrounds, because I believe managing pensions is a multidisciplinary thing. So having different backgrounds around the table to make decisions is very important. And as I said, small pension funds might have difficulties to cope with these, but what they can do, and I think that's the most important thing, is making sure there is the right culture, that there is an inclusive decision-making process, that everyone has a say, that each question can be asked, and that's something we can work on, all of us. So I think that's the main point. It's not just about gender and age.
Yeah, so it's about the culture. Samantha, what do you think? Do we need regulation for that or not?
A good starting point. But as Tanachia said, obviously there's quite a lot of different codes at the moment, and I don't think one size fits all in terms of the makeup of different schemes and trustee boards. But I do think, incentives such as charters that trustee boards have to commit to and sign up to is a brilliant first start. Otherwise, it's kind of one of those things that you kind of go, yeah, we'll get around to it, and then it never happens. I think in terms of regulation, though, that would be quite difficult. And ultimately, we still want the best people in the jobs. So appreciate, obviously, we do need a diverse range of people with different skills, different backgrounds, different cultures. But also we still need kind of the stewards who are kind of driving that ship So I wouldn't want to be in a place where we're selecting people but aren't necessarily the right people for the jobs which they're in. So I think charters are a great way to kind of improve the level of diversity across the whole range of different pension schemes. But again, I think it should be driven by culture and actually what is best for the scheme members themselves.
Yeah, thank you. In the meanwhile, I would like to say that, like, for the watchers at home, you can ask your questions in the system. If you have any questions, please ask them. And I would like to ask you all, what kind of advice would you give to pension? There are a lot of pension funds in this webinar now. What kind of advice would you say if they want to work on the diversity of the board? Can I start with you?
I think it's good to have a discussion about it. I think it's good to see what you can do, and if you can do something, I think we need to go for it. So yes, every pension fund should put the discussion on the table, and we should make sure that the awareness is there.
Do you have something to add on that, Samantha?
I would say to kind of pension funds that are listening, it's something that you need to be aware of because it is coming. From a UK perspective, the regulator is very concerned about lack of diversity on trustee boards, and they are pushing for more to be done. So I think it's a case of exploring what you currently have, at least doing a quick, taking stock of where you are currently and put in plans, a way to change that before, essentially we might be pushed into doing it if, the regulator gets, has kind of had enough of waiting for us to act. So I think it's a problem that's not going to go away. And again, I think from a UK's perspective, more and more people are saving every year. So, that saving population gets bigger. So there's always going to be a greater demand on a trustee board that is representative of their scheme members. So it's a problem that's not going away. So jump ahead of it.
Say it's a problem, it will never go away. So we will never have diverse enough pension funds. Boards, you mean? Yes?
I don't think you'd ever be told off for having a diverse trustee board, put it that way.
Tanachia, you have to add something on that?
Yeah, maybe just finally one thought is if you really want to realize diversity and inclusion, just go for it and look for expertise within the board that could be used to achieve that goal, or otherwise call in external experts to help you to develop certain policies or initiatives, or otherwise culture experts to realize an inclusive culture. And one of the things that really strike me is that the boards that really were motivated to realize diverse and inclusive boards also ask their social partners to rethink their nominations because it didn't fit at their diverse board to that extent. And that isn't quite common, at least not in the Netherlands, but I'm sure you could make a change in asking for different candidates that meet more diverse criteria as well.
Yeah. Okay. And I would like to discuss more about data as well. For example, I'm a pension fund and I would like to have a more diverse board, but it's difficult to select on certain personal data, actually. For example, sexual preferences. Like, how do you see that? Like, the data data and privacy laws, is it conflicting with each other, you think? It's a difficult question, I know.
Is it conflicting? I think we all know the GDPR and we have to respect it. So I think it's much more tough to use some private data to use in a selection process. I think that's not done. But of course, that doesn't prohibit you to install an inclusive decision structure, and it's not because there is not a gay person in the board that you can't talk about benefits or whatever, and that you can't put the subject on the agenda.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Samantha, what do you think about it?
Okay, forgetting to unmute myself. So I think in terms of kind of increasing or getting trustees to think about it now, was that the question?
It's data, like how can you collect data on personal backgrounds if you want to have a more diverse pension board?
I think that's probably one of the biggest problems and obstacles to why we don't currently have decent quality data, in that we haven't ever asked for the data. I think Tanachia is probably much better placed in terms of her research and what she's done on this. But how can we encourage it? I think, you know, there's lots of different recruitment tools where you can, you know, essentially do blind CVs, and you're not screening people based on their sex, their age, their ethnic background. But I also think you could positively discriminate. So, there are some job vacancies in the UK where you are asking for certain people to apply, and if you are a trustee board that's committed to fairer representation, you could start doing more positive discrimination to make sure that you are getting candidates who you do want to be sitting on your board, and also younger. So there's a real gap in the UK for boards typically being older. So there's quite a lot of different initiatives in the UK where they are trying to train up kind of the next generation of younger people to sit on trustee boards. But again, these kind of smaller initiatives that probably need a little bit more airtime.
Thank you. I think a lot of nice advices here for the pension funds. So we still have a couple of minutes for your questions at home. To ask a question, I have to say you have to hover your mouse over the screen, and then you will have an option to ask your questions. To make the link to the next panel, should pension funds also include diversity of the boards of investee companies in their ESG policy and the engagement programs? So we will make the link with investments now. So the diversity of the boards is one thing, of course, but should we also make more action of the diversity of boards of the investee companies? What do you think?
You can do so, but then I think it's better to first make the exercise for your own board. But of course, if you put diversity high on the agenda for yourself, I think it's logic that you also ask it for others to include it on their agenda.
So first the pension fund itself, and then you can do the investments. Okay, thanks.
I think it's hard to defend it the other way around.
Yeah. Do you think the same, Tanachia, or not?
Yeah, I agree. I don't really have a different opinion on that. And I also think that if you have a diverse board, there are also different decisions being made in what kind of organizations or investment companies you work with, and what kind of investments is being used for the pension funds. There is some research that shows that boards that have more women and more younger persons really think about what kind of effects certain decisions have regarding climate change and that sort of things. So it impacts the decision making within the board, but also could have an effect on external outcomes and the kind of organizations are being worked with.
Samantha, you have 10 seconds to add something on that, and you have the end conclusions.
Yeah, I'd say start within before you start looking elsewhere. Would be my main thing. But again, it's part of the whole ESG. So obviously, if we're tackling the S and diversity and investments, would arguably be the E part of it, as well as the S and the G. So yeah, it's all totally interlinked.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanachia and Samantha. Thank you so much for this panel. I think it was good to discuss, but we cannot discuss this enough, I think, so we have to discuss it even more in the future. And like a lot of work is done already, but we should still do a lot of work in the future as well. This is the end of this panel. We will switch over now to a video of Candriam with an example of the social and governance factors in ESG.
We have seen responsible investing develop over the past decade. We have seen a lot of focus on the E recently from both policymakers and investors. Representing Candriam, an asset manager with a strong ESG track record, what role do you think the S plays?
Well, if you go back to the history of ESG, it all started with the S. First, ESG funds had really a social dimension. I recall, back in 1996, our funds were already focusing on labor regulations, on training, on issues related to health and safety in the workplace. At the same time, some portion of the management fees began to be allocated to social development projects. Over time, ESG became more holistic. Financial market discussions began to center less on the S in favor of the E, and in some countries, investment focus was drawn towards the G of governance. Good governance includes, of course, best practices. One should not forget that great governance means transparency, independence, respect of shareholders and minority shareholders, as well as sound remuneration policies. The demand for social investments is growing by the day, both in the bond and equity space, as well as in private markets. Going forward, sustainable finance shows the need for a social taxonomy, which I welcome. It will bring more standardization to the debate, more clarity, and comparability.
What lessons can practitioners take from the SFDR environmental taxonomy?
Talking about SFDR and the green taxonomy, I would like to provide you with two observations. First, SFDR entered into practice in March 2021. We are 18 months down the road, and half of the fund industry can be classified as using ESG factors under either Article 8 or Article 9. This is amazing considering the fund industry manages 8 trillion euros. This year, in a very difficult market environment where equities and bonds lost value at double-digit rates, Article 9 funds are the only bright spot. They have achieved positive inflows despite the high content of growth securities they hold and despite the exclusion of the energy sector. I'm sure you have noticed that in 2022, the fossil fuel companies enjoyed very positive returns. Then my second observation is that I'm disappointed to note that because the green taxonomy is not yet fully deployed into regulation, especially when it comes to obliging companies to report properly, the overall alignment with taxonomy is lower than 10%. Hopefully, when we get to a social taxonomy, we will not face this kind of issues, and we will be able to have a higher alignment.
The battle against climate change requires a fundamental economic transition. There is concern that this will place an extra burden on certain parts of the population. There is the notion of a just transition, but how to put this into practice?
A just transition means greening the economy in a way that is as fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. Nearly 1.5 billion workers around the globe will be affected in some way or another by energy transition. The Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has identified employment risks in climate-critical sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, buildings and construction, transport and energy. Within the energy sector only, a just transition could create 24 million new jobs between now and 2030, according to the International Labour Organization. A just transition means maximizing the social and economic opportunities of climate action, while minimizing and carefully managing the challenges. This approach is important for nations at all levels of development. The figures from the UN show that a just transition is a necessity for all economic sectors, by no means limited to energy supply, and in urban and rural areas alike. I would like to highlight 3 items to take into account. First, we need to prevent social washing. This means making sure that we can harmonize the measurement of social sustainability, allowing investors to make informed and consistent decisions. Second, we need private capital to fund innovation in all of the sectors I have mentioned before, and we need standards for measuring social impact as a key tool to drive investor decisions. Third, we need to clearly measure social risks, such as reputational, operational, social grievances, human rights violations, liability issues, and even supply chain disruptions. All of these translates into material risks for investors. Making a success of a just transition implies massive investments in innovation and new technologies, and will be accompanied by profound upheavals that will affect the very nature of work. With all of this in mind, we can make sure that a just transition can become a positive disruption.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the studio. We just heard from Renato about the importance of social and governance factors in investing, and we're going to delve deeper into this topic in the next panel, which is titled Incorporating Social and Governance Factors in the Investments of Pension Funds. We have a distinguished panel to get into this. As Renato set out, environmental issues are now very much at the forefront of regulatory thinking, but also with investors. However, social issues is really how ESG started, and governance issues became more important as the shift towards financial risk meant it was necessary to start considering these types of issues. So while the E has been stealing the limelight in Brussels, a lot of pension investors have continued to care about the S and the G. So we have three distinguished speakers to delve deeper into this topic. First, here on my right, we have Philippe Dutertre from Dutertre MONDIALE. He is a special advisor on sustainable finance to the group's chief investment officer and has been instrumental in developing the group's SRI franchise. Then on my left, we have Jan Rasmussen, who is head of ESG at Pension Denmark. He has held this position since 2009, and prior to that, he has worked in the Danish Ministry of Finance and as a chief economist to the Danish Confederation of Trade Unions. And then finally, joining us online is Brenda Kramer. She works as a senior advisor on responsible investment for PGGM, the Dutch pension investment manager. She's responsible for the implementation of the the EU Sustainable Finance Regulations for PGGM and their pension fund clients. And importantly, for the past 5 years, she has been in part of the European Platform on Sustainable Finance, and as such has been named part of the top 50 most influential women in sustainable finance. So before we go into the first question, we want to engage the audience at home, and we're going to pull up a poll question, which you can answer now, and we're going to discuss the results later. So the poll question, which should be popping up on your screen right now, is: what is driving developments in considering social and governance factors in your investment policy? Is that A, regulation, B, the preferences of members and clients, C, reputational risks, and D, financial risks? So I'm very curious what the audience will give back to us. We will discuss it in a minute. But first, we'll go to all speakers with a question about how their particular organization deals with social and governance issues. What are the issues that they care about, and what are the tools that they are employing to actually make these investable? So, Philippe, if I can give the floor to you to kick it off.
Yes, sure. Dutertre MONDIALE has for the last 20 years been extending the scope of its responsible investment approach to all asset classes and investment strategies. This voluntary, gradual and methodical deployment of ESG now encompasses 100% of the group's assets under management. This commitment to a sustainable and inclusive economy and to ESG consideration has been deployed within a framework structured by the very well-known Article 173 of the French law and a responsible investment charter that the groups adopted in 2016. The entry in 2018 of Dutertre MONDIALE into the Investor College of the UNPRI, in coherence with its signature in 2006 of the United Nations Global Compact, quite naturally gives SDGs a reference role within the group's CSR approach and responsible investment policy, contributing to their legitimacy, readability, and visibility. We therefore strive to align our initiatives and investments with 9 SDGs intrinsically linked to our culture, activities, and territorial roots. Fight against poverty, health and well-being for all, creation of inclusive and decent works, reduction of inequalities, development of territories and their communities, peaceful society. Our investment policy aimed at allowing us to retain rooms for maneuver in relation to the constraints associated with the regulatory framework. And we use this leeway to pursue the operational implementation of our S&G commitments. The adoption of our raison d'être in May 2020 constitutes another major step in this process, catalyzing an acceleration in the consideration of ESG factors. The adoption of this raison d'être took place against the background of the first phase of the health crisis that was synonymous for her with baptism of fire, as it required an exceptional commitment of the group, financial commitment of the group to its clients. 3 objectives are attached to the group's raison d'être: supporting its customers throughout their increasingly long lives, helping to consolidate the economy and jobs that form the basis of social protection, and third, to leave a more livable and supportive world to future generations. To support its customers throughout their increasingly long lives, the group acquired 67% of Egide Domitis in June 2021, a pioneer and leader in senior citizen residences in France, and as such, a key player in the silver economy. To help consolidate the economy and jobs that form the basis of social protection, the group is continuing to deploy its private equity and private debt programs to bequeath to future generations a more livable world with more solidarity. Ashikali MONDIALE continues its sustainable bond subscription program. Thank you, Baptiste.
Thank you very much for that. Before we go to Jan, can I remind the viewers at home that it is possible to ask a question directly to us. You need to hover your mouse over the screen and then you can type your question to us. So Jan, from your perspective, how do you employ SNG tools in your investment policy?
Pension Denmark is a labor market pension fund, so we are born as a non-profit pension scheme born out of the social partners and from collective agreements in Denmark. And that goes into our DNA, and also means that exactly what you said in the beginning, that when we started to work with ESG, in fact, S was probably the most important, and now the world has sort of turned around the last 5 or 7 years. So the E, and especially climate, the climate crisis mitigation of it has been at the focus of much of what we are doing, both as active owners, responsible investors, and as impact investors. But certainly the S is very important for us still, also in our daily work. We have which is quite natural when one thinks about where we come from. We have a preference for collective agreements, for respect for companies to respect ILO core conventions on labor rights. We also have diversity and inclusion as very important factors for us, and we look especially on gender issues, wage gap between men and women, and we also look at the wage dispersion within organizations and across industries. And we like to have, as active owners, conversations with companies about these issues, and we can also vote against companies on their annual general meetings if we are not satisfied with what they're doing. Right now, there have been some very big votings on Amazon's annual general meeting this year, and we have been very active in what has been going on there. On the G, we have also gender diversity at the board level, of course, as a priority for us. If companies come with only male candidates, we will not support all of them on the annual general meetings, and we will vote against some of them. We also think that remuneration should be transparent, which is very important for us also as investors to understand what are the long-term incentives in remuneration packages for CEOs and other members of the management. We respect, let me add that we respect that there could be some good reason not to be too transparent about some of the short-term incentives, but that's a special case, I think. One last thing I would mention now at the beginning is that we cannot support combined CEOs and chairs in companies. So we will say that is not a good way to have corporate governance in companies, and we vote against combined chairs and CEOs as active owners.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. Interesting to see that in the previous panel on diversity, the diversity experts were a bit coy about actually investing and engaging based on board diversity, but you are actually just doing it and putting it in practice. So we've heard about the SDGs, we've heard about engagement. Brenda, does PGGM have another flavor to add to this mix of investing in ESG factors?
Different angles when it comes to. Can you hear me well? I hear an echo. So when it comes to social, we take two different angles, which is firstly, we look which businesses have a positive impact by their products and services. And secondly, we look at how they do their business, which basically means looking what do they do and how do they do it. Both have to be, both are screened, but how they do it for us is an essential precondition basically to step into a company, which means that we have a minimum requirements based on the OECD guidelines and the UN guiding principles before we invest in a company throughout our portfolio. Now I'll tell a bit more on that in a bit, but first of all on social impact, which has been also a discussion if you have looked at the European taxonomy, a project that I've been very involved in. There has been a call from pension funds to include social investments in that as well, which is, I think, a very justified call and very important call, especially if you look into, the wish of the European Commission to have a just transition. Now, within PGGM, and actually we're doing this together also with APG, the other big pension provider or pension manager in the Netherlands, is that for products with a social impact, we've developed a taxonomy-based filter based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, indeed. It has already come up with the first speaker. I think is a very important framework for us as well. Well, on the basis of this taxonomy, we aim to increase our investments in, for example, health-related products or affordable housing. And so we measure these investments every year and report the percentages to our clients. And we do this actually together with other asset owners. So we've set up a special asset owner platform, which is a cooperative platform called the SDI AOP. And it has actually by now become an international initiative also with American and Australian partners. We provide the data to commercial investors as well. So I think this has been a very successful way to actually set up a measurement for environmental as well as social investments. Then secondly, I already said that for us, a minimum requirement to invest is that a company adheres to responsible business conduct. And as most Dutch pension funds, and Matthijs, you know a lot about it, we have signed the International Responsible Business Conduct Agreements, or in Dutch, IMBB Covenant. And the way we implemented that is that we've actually built a screen throughout our portfolio that screens companies that we are invested in on reputational and controversy-based data. We source from different data providers, and based on the score that a company gets, we decide to divest or engage with a company to improve their score. Now, I have to be honest, I think for public market data, this is easier than for private market investments. The data there are not as accessible as for public markets, but nevertheless, we do actually screen our private equity investments, and also for infrastructure and private real estate, we do engage. And one of the, if you talk about governance, one of the largest pillars of this screen is indeed governance. So has the company organized itself well? But we also look at, well, indeed, employee relations and the things that have been highlighted as well in the report of the Sustainable Finance Platform and by the OECD guidelines. So yeah, I think to summarize, there's many other things we do if we go deeper into governance, but I think to summarize, I think what I wanted to highlight here today is indeed these two different lenses. So look at your investments from an impact perspective and see what do they actually contribute to the world by what they produce or which service they provide. And then on the other side, how do they produce them? So make sure that, you know, you can build affordable housing, but if it's done through forced labor, there is a large negative impact as well. So I think those two angles we see back also in the financial, Sustainable Finance Platform advices are very important to take if we look at social issues.
Thanks, Brenda, for that overview. And I think, you know, what is also known as the horizontal and vertical approach. We'll maybe touch upon that later when we talk about the social taxonomy. But first, let's have a look at the results of the poll. So they appear here on my screen. The question was, what is driving developments in considering social and governance factors in your investment policy? And we have a very, very clear winner coming in hot with 62%. It is regulation. Then at 23% second, preferences of members or clients. And then only with around 8% each reputational risk and financial risk. Is that interesting? I mean, ESG integration maybe not so long ago was all about, you know, managing financial risks, and now it's only at the bottom. Philippe, maybe short comment.
Yes, certainly. I would also emphasize the role of soft law. I guess you all remember this Latin expression, dura lex, sed lex. So I shall venture to say today, soft law, sed lex.
Okay, so you're just adding another option on the table.
Yeah.
Jan, do you find these numbers remarkable?
Yes, I do. And I would, my answer to that questionnaire would be that it's our stakeholders, our members, who wants us to be active in ESG. And of course, regulation drives it a bit, but the most important factor behind our work is certainly that our members want it. And I also think what Brenda mentioned, impact, the importance of impact, so many new ways to invest in as an active and powerful investor are on the way today. We are contributing to a blended finance SDG fund together with the Danish DFI, where we have a lot of investments in different African projects, helping
you could say, trying to make life better on all the SDG scores. And as a builder, I think it was a very good example with the affordable housing. Is if it's been affordable because of forced labor, it's maybe not that interesting. We have ourselves made it as a requirement when we build that there are collective agreements and social clauses in every part of the chain when we are building. So it is important to think about it, but we can also have a lot of impact, and that is, I think, very interesting for our members.
Okay, so we come up with 4 answers. We already have 6 potential now. Brenda, I know that you are working on SFDR implementation, so you surely must have answered A yourself, or what's your take on this?
I actually didn't answer. I was so focused on speaking. Yes, no, I'm actually quite surprised because in SFDR, well, there is some social, but what we see in general in the regulation up to now, if you look at taxonomy, for example, it is very environmental focused, as you already said in your introduction as well. So I would have actually thought it's more of a, well, based on, as Jan said, the participants, but also reputational. So we use sources like RepRisk that actually come from how is the company into the news, and can we link any controversies to a certain company. And so I'm indeed quite surprised as well that it is that regulatory stands out so much. Looking ahead, I do think that the next phases of the implementation of the sustainable finance package do focus indeed on social. If you look at the CSDDD, the due diligence directive, it is really focused on how do you do your business and how do you are you accountable for the processes. So I think it's good that regulation comes, and if apparently the people that are listening today think it helps, I hope it does. But I am really surprised actually by these results.
Okay, clear answer, thanks. And you already made a segue into the next question by talking about the next developments. You have been a member of the platform on sustainable finance, so you've been close to the development of the platform's guidance on minimum safeguards, as well as the design of the social taxonomy. So this is only an advice yet, and the Commission still has to take it on board. But can you maybe take us through what these 2 pieces of advice are and what they would mean for a pension fund investor?
Of course. So what the platform has done is pretty much in line with indeed this horizontal and vertical axis that we spoke about. It's actually it. The platform has developed a report on the social taxonomy last year, which included advices on how can you extend the scope of this environmental taxonomy that's being proposed now to a taxonomy that includes social activities as well. Because if you look at the taxonomy as it stands, there are certain things that you actually would miss in that taxonomy. As I said before, it's affordable housing, it's healthcare, things that are not included in the environmental taxonomy, but are clearly important if you look at the just transition objective. I think social taxonomy is something we have asked for as pension funds as well. Unfortunately, I do think it will take a while before the Commission actually will implement it as part of the taxonomy. What we see now is that we're still waiting for the 4 additional environmental objectives, and social is also less black and white, I think, than, for example, climate mitigation, where there are clear indicators already in the markets. So I do think we have to wait a bit for that. Now, what is very interesting is that the taxonomy as a whole, leave it either environmental or social objective, it has the requirement of a minimum safeguard, which means that if you classify a taxonomy investment as having a substantial contribution, it needs to adhere to a certain minimum safeguards. And those are comparable to the thing that we do at PGGM, but I would say that the platform's advice on that actually goes a bit further than what is currently being done in the markets. Now, this advice was published in October, so it's very fresh, and the platform has basically looked in, okay, if you have minimum safeguards, what should they include? And obviously, this minimum safeguard requirement has a direct link with other legislation like SFDR and CSRD and the upcoming CSDDD. And I think what we've done in the report, we've said, well, minimum, the 5 mandatory social indicators, if you look at the principal adverse impacts in SFDR, should be incorporated in minimum social safeguards of minimum safeguards. But also we've looked at 4 other topics that are, in our opinion, extremely important based on, looking at OECD guidelines, UN guiding principles, UN Global Compact, which would focus on human rights, including worker rights, bribery and corruption, taxation, and fair competition. And now what the report does, because we've acknowledged that, information on social indicators is still rather hard to get on many indicators. We have included guidance on what can you look at as an investor. Obviously, we're hoping that CSRD will include, so the reporting, the corporate reporting on sustainability based in CSRD will include an indicator or at least a assurance for investors that a company has the right processes in place to manage the whole production chain. So ideally, as an investor, you do get information on what are the corporate due diligence processes on human rights, labor rights, bribery, taxation, and fair competition. That's not always the case yet, but I'm expecting this information will increase over the next couple of years. Now, furthermore, so that is the first indicator that the platform has said, well, ideally, we can look at that as an investor. Well, secondly, you could look at like final liability of companies in respect to breaches. So has this company been found guilty for a certain controversy or a certain break of law? Thirdly, you could look at the lack of cooperation with the national contact points. Those contact points are part of the OECD network of national contact points, and we do expect of companies that they are willing to collaborate with these points once there is a doubt on how the diligence is designed and implemented. And fourthly, we said, well, if there's no response to allegations by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, that would also be an indicator of a company not adhering to minimum safeguards. I think an important point that the platform has made and is that ESG screening or ESG scores, as they are used currently, are not optimal to look at minimum safeguards. It is the best we have now in the market, but I think looking forward, or ESG scores will become more controversial as there are big differences as well between the different ESG providers. So that's something to take into account. Yeah, I think that was already a lot of information for now. So let's move on.
It's a lot, but there's a lot of things happening, so it's good for people at home to be aware of that. you did mention that the platform is trying to link the pieces of the puzzle where possible. Still, it's a lot. So maybe over to Jan, given that we are facing more and more regulation, people at home clearly thought it was driving the agenda. Do you think this is the case, or are there other considerations still more important? And how do you feel about all of this regulation? Is it fit for purpose or tough to implement?
I think it helps a lot, because what we need as investors is to have info from the companies and projects we invest in. And what we need is to move away from scores to metrics, because then we can make our own assessment and our own scores. All investors doesn't have to be alike. So the more metrics we get from the companies and projects we invest in, that will be very helpful for us. And I think the CSRD is a promising development here. We could get a very interesting portal where we could source data and metrics from ourselves. And I certainly also think that there are some help from the minimum social safeguards, from the PIA indicators in the SFDR regulations, that can help us to get more data about social issues. So even though the social taxonomy probably will be disposed or postponed, and this commission will not deliver it, it has 2 years to deliver it. It won't happen. So it will be it will be postponed. I think there are interesting developments in regulations. And I would just like to catch what Renato said just before this panel, that he said there were 3 things that he thought was important with the social taxonomy. But one thing, the 2 things that is important for us out of those 3 is to get some metrics, some data, so we can measure that we have impact. That's what we want. Data to measure impact.
All right. Thank you very much, Jan. Then the final question for Philippe. So as you go on this journey of developing your S and your G policies, how do you get there? Do you do it alone, or is working together with peers and perhaps competitors an important element of realizing your ambitions?
Yes, thank you. Working, thinking together, learning from others. In the field of responsible investment, the time of the pioneers has been followed by the one of regulation and soft law. The first 15 years of this century have been very exciting for sustainable investment in terms of ESG initiatives. But it proved to be a period during which this approach had to overcome many crises in terms of legitimacy, win many battles before moving from the status of an accessory or peripheral issues to that of a must-have. Arthur Schopenhauer is supposed to have once said, all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as self-evident. During this period, cooperation with peers proved to be a source of inspiration. Thank you, Pension Denmark. Thank you, PGGM. And a way to integrate their best practices, a mean to consolidate achievements and the extension of the field of responsible investment. But today, regulation, be it on national or European level, has indeed come and gone. It means that we have entered a new paradigm, characterized by a further extension of the perimeter in terms of the issues being addressed, a feeling of acceleration, if not tsunami, pressures from stakeholders, and the risk of controversy. Cooperation, which means working, thinking together, learning from each other, is therefore, and more than ever, a necessity when it comes to influence and understand a new regulatory framework. Moreover, when we look at the 2030 agenda, most SDGs relate to S and G issues, and SDG number 17, Partnership for the Goal, is a call for cooperation.
Thank you, Philippe. Very inspiring words. And that almost concludes this panel. So we're trying to ask every single speaker to give us one key takeaway. If we can condense these 40 minutes into one takeaway. Philippe, what would be yours?
Some imagine, some do. Paritarian institutions do both.
Very, very, very good. Jan?
If we get the right metrics and data, we can, as responsible investors, do good and do well at the same time.
Thanks. If I would have to have one, it would be metrics, not scores. So I think that's a very good takeaway. Brenda, from you?
That social aspects should be a minimum requirement for every investment, no matter how environmentally good it is. So and preferably meet the metrics that Jan was talking about.
Thank you. And that's how we get E, S, and G combined. I think that's a very nice conclusion of this panel. So that just leaves me to hand it over, I think, to Alexandra for the final words on this conference. I thank the viewers very much for watching this panel, and who knows, maybe we see each other in Brussels at some point.
I would like to thank all of you who joined us online this afternoon, and of course those speakers for their great contributions to our program. As a conclusion from today, I can say that in the current environment, it remains more important than ever to work towards common objectives and to keep those in mind for all future policy and legislative decisions. Objectives as promoting inclusiveness, transparency, and representation of all EU citizens should be the driving force for all policy reforms in the context of pensions. I would like to, at this point, thank all of you who joined us online, all speakers for their participation, of course, and all colleagues from AEIP and PensionsEurope for the great collaboration we had in the past months in the organization of this event. Our event was organized as part of the second edition of the European Retirement Week. There are many great events to follow in the next few days, so don't hesitate to check the website of the European Retirement Week to have more information on what's to come. And as a last point from our side, there would be a survey that would pop up on your screen, so we would very much appreciate your feedback on how the event was organized and the content of the sessions. So with this, as a last remark, thank you again for joining us.